So I'm Deborah Ashby and I am the President of the Royal Statistical Society. Many of you I welcomed last night, but for those that have turned up since then, welcome to the conference. What we have now is the Campion lecture, which is the President's invited lecture. So this is the one slot in the entire conference where I get to choose who speaks. And I thought long and hard about who to invite. And I thought I want somebody who's doing something a bit different with connections to our world. And then I thought, right, this is actually an easy problem. So I've invited Charlotte Watt, who started life as a mathematician, came through that into epidemiology and holds, and in fact still holds, a chair at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, doing sort of social epidemiology among other things. But about 4 years ago, she's then taken a really important role of Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for International Development, which covers the world of health, but also all sorts of other things. And it's just such a great illustration of the career pathways that you can have starting off from something like maths that many people don't see how it's going to apply. So I thought, I'm going to invite Charlotte, and I was absolutely delighted when she accepted. So I'm not going to talk anymore because it's Charlotte you want to hear. So Charlotte Watt, the stage is yours.
So, good afternoon. It's just past 12. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a real privilege to be asked to come and present at this important conference. As you've heard, I've had a bit of an eclectic period, sort of career trajectory, and I think increasingly that's the way the world goes. I think with our long span of life when we're going to work, I think it really is great to sort of thinking about, changing field, and that's very much something I've believed in over time. But actually having the basis of mathematics at my core, I think has always done me in really good stead, because what I like to think about is when I get given a challenging problem, or I'll get asked some question I've never thought about by one of the ministers that I have to advise in my role as Chief Scientific Advisor. I think a key asset that statisticians have, that mathematicians have, is that way of just trying to think through problems logically to try and really apply quite sort of rational sort of ways of thinking to difficult problems. So, yeah, I've had an eclectic career path, but I think actually the mathematics training that I got both at undergraduate and degree level has served me well. Anyway, what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about harnessing the power of data to drive development, and really coming from the perspective of now having worked in DFID for 4 years and having a responsibility both to oversee and steer our substantial research investments. So DFID is very much an evidence-based department. It invests more than 3% of its budget in research and innovation, so that's about £400 million a year, but also through other work that hasn't been badged as research, but other innovations that have come up from our country offices, from our policy teams working on data. Because I think we all know this, the data revolution is everywhere, and the data revolution is impacting on everything that we do. It's providing us new opportunities to think about both what we might expect, but also problems that we never thought would be open to data, rigorous data analysis or other forms of data analysis. For those of you who don't come from a development background, I just want to first kick off just talking a little bit about the history of development, and I'm just going to do that as a scene setter, because often people think, when they think about development, they think about the issues that they see on the news. They think about people starving. They think about how many people don't have enough food to eat. What we don't talk about enough, and what the press doesn't talk about enough, is actually the huge gains and change that we're seeing globally. So if you look at those first two plots, on the left you can see the distribution of extreme poverty back in 1975. So you've got a bimodal distribution here, where you can see you've got this big red peak of people living in extreme poverty, and a lot of those people were in Asia. If we fast forward now to 2015, you'll see that big Asian bulge has moved to the right. They're wealthier. Those people are wealthier. And so if you just look at the tail end, the left-hand side of that 2015 distribution, you'll see that there's far fewer people in Asia living in extreme poverty, but we still have large numbers, hundreds of millions in sub-Saharan Africa living in extreme poverty. So the face of poverty is changing. The other thing, when you scratch into the detail a little bit, is how much now, when we look at Africa, there's great heterogeneity. There's quite a lot of variability. We're seeing some countries with very, very strong economic growth rates, stronger than we're seeing in Europe. But we're seeing other countries that are really stuck. And often what's keeping them stuck is issues of fragility and poor governance. So increasingly, when we're thinking about how do we tackle extreme poverty, and that's the mission of our department, we have a simple objective in everything that we do, which is to tackle extreme poverty. We're really thinking about how do we tackle quite complicated situations where you might have weak conflict, you might have weak governance, you have conflict driving the extreme vulnerability that persists. The other thing when we think about the development space is the breadth of challenges now that the world is facing. So that link with conflict, the extent to which conflict is persisting and has expanded over the past decade. The issue of population growth is incredibly important, and one that many development agencies are focusing on, particularly if we focus on sub-Saharan Africa. If we think about resource use, natural resource use, population growth is a fundamental pressure. It's going to be a fundamental driver of increasing pressures around loss of biodiversity impacts and compound the impacts of climate change. Urbanization, we're seeing across the world and also in sub-Saharan Africa, rapid rates of urbanization. Inequality is also coming up as a much more important issue. So even when we look at some of the Asian countries, where if you look at the GDP on average, it's gone up. That average figure might hide huge levels of inequality, where you still have large numbers of people in poorer countries who are undernourished, who have severe needs. And then clearly there's the huge impacts of climate change. And when we're thinking what might the world look like in 2030, those potential scenarios for different levels of degree change really have profound implications for how we think about development. We'll be expecting temperature rise. We'll be expecting increasingly severe weather events. We are seeing already those impacts. We're seeing changes in crop growing periods, those sorts of things. So in our development investment, we're trying to look ahead, and particularly in our science investment, to say how do we develop the technologies that can help us cope with those pressures. There are issues that are very high on the political agenda, so issues such as migrant crises. We have new disease outbreaks, so quite a lot of my time at the moment is focused on responding, providing science advice and thinking about other investments and evidence that we can bring to bear to inform strengthen the current response to the Ebola outbreak in DRC, for example, and also think about how do we use data to understand what might be the particular pockets of vulnerability in neighboring countries. And as the outbreak is right on the border of several countries, that's a very high level policy question for us. How do we target vaccination? How do we target prevention to the right place? We have pervasive and ongoing challenges, such as gender equality. I've spent a lot of my career as a social epidemiologist testing interventions to prevent violence against women. And lastly, new and emerging threats such as drug resistance, and that's both things like antibiotic resistance, but also resistance to TB, resistance linked to our interventions on malaria that threaten to reverse some of the gains and successes that we've made over the past decade and 20 years. So when I was asked to come and talk about, I was told I can come and talk about something that really excites me. I was really spoiled for choice. When I thought about the breadth of the challenges, and then what are the sorts of things as a department that we're supporting, working with many partners, I'm sure with many people in this room. I really struggled to think about actually what are the key things that I want to tell you about. And the breadth of examples that I had to pick from included what are some of the real big innovations that come out of our major research investments. And what I'm seeing is really exciting applications of data science, of AI, of machine learning, of use of satellite data coming from across our research portfolio. I'm also seeing very exciting innovations coming from some of the core support that as a department we provide to data statistical services, to some of the international infrastructure. And I'm also seeing really important innovations coming from our country offices, where we have specialist advisors who are there trying to support the countries, to support our country offices to support national governments to develop, basically, to respond to the challenges that they face. And when I'm trying to think about the way forward, and I'm sure it's the same in the data and statistical more generally, is how do we make sense of the exciting breadth of opportunity that we see throughout those different examples, and how do we think about them, what's an agenda around moving forward? So what I'm going to do today is to try and cover a few different bits of each of those. So first, I'm going to talk through in a little bit more depth 3 examples and the very recent examples of ways in which data, rapid analysis, big data, the data revolution is changing the way that we're working. I'm then going to talk a bit about some of the AI applications that are coming up in development. And it's interesting because when I hear about the narrative around AI, often it's focusing on the threats, but in the portfolio that we're looking at, we're very much trying to think about what are the real big opportunities of AI, but clearly be alert to what might be threats that we need to be cognizant of and think about tackling along the way. And then lastly, finish off with some discussion, a little bit of some of the thinking about how our portfolio is evolving and some of the issues if we think about what's the overall national and global data governance and systems that in the end we need to be working effectively to really harness and tap into the opportunities of data. So, okay, the first of my 3 examples is one that's just happened really recently. So this, I'm sure you will remember, is the Cyclone Idai. So that was a hugely powerful cyclone that hit Mozambique, Zimbabwe, that very rapidly devastated and essentially undermined the development progress of many, many locations very rapidly. So when that happened, one of my jobs as a chief scientific advisor is to say, how can we use science to inform what we do? And for those sorts of questions, it's not, okay, I can give you some analysis and I can give you a paper in 6 months, or I can tell you once my research fellow comes back from holiday or whatever. When we're in these situations, it's very much a live situation. So we have our emergency teams stand up and are basically interacting with all of the international players to say, how do we get the right resources, the UN resources, national resources, targeted to the right, where the need is greatest. What we can do on the science side is try and understand where that need is greatest, but also try and use predictive analysis to say, well, what do we think is going to happen next? Because often the front end of the response is really in the here and now. Have we got mosquito nets out there? Have we got clean water? Have we got beds? Have we got emergency shelter? They haven't got that luxury of saying, actually, what might happen next week? Is there something else that might happen that we need to be starting to prepare for now? So that is what, in the science advice, we try and do. And as part of ensuring that we have the capability to try and do that, we have great partnerships with a number of different agencies that help us. And just like we sort of go on to a sort of 24-hour emergency response, some of those academics really do the same thing and really go beyond, I think, go beyond the kind of general ask or expectation of an academic to help us do that. And particularly for Idai, we're drawing really heavily on great expertise from Met Office, from Reading, and from Bristol. So in this case, we had the cyclone hit, and so we then requested emergency reports. So we were getting forecasts of what's going to happen next in terms of rainfall, in terms of what's going to happen in terms of the movement of the cyclone. And over that process, over that emergency, we ended up having 6 reports. And what was really powerful about that is it really helped us to understand what might be the potential future flood risk. How might water flow? You know, we were seeing heavy rainfall. We were worried about might that flow down river and burst dams further down the rivers. So it was that sort of modeling analysis, along with the weather analysis that we needed, the weather predictions that we needed to pull together very rapidly. And we're able to draw on quite specialized modeling capability about modeling both shallow water and deep water flows. And in the end, that information was fed out, and it was used by ourselves and by our country offices, who were a central part of the response, but also by the EU response and the EU and the UN humanitarian response actors, and as well as in Mozambique, my national agencies. So we got these ECMWF reports, as you can see there. We got these precise modeling projections, and it very much then fed directly into our operational. So to give you a sort of bird's eye level of how that modeling works, what we end up is combining meteorological forecasts, different types of hydrological model projections, combining them with, putting them onto a geospatial product that then can be used very directly by operational teams. And a key thing here is getting the analysis right, communicating the level of uncertainty, and then thirdly, also just making sure that the information gets out in a way that's accessible so that somebody on the ground can use this information. In practice, within my team, I have people who are very used to doing that brokering of saying, how do I pull together these different data sources and get them in the format? They know the questions that the operational teams will have, and they form a very, very important translational role in making this translate to actual impact. And this just gives you a little bit more detail of one of the projections, which is showing, this is for Malawi, showing projections on the left of where, an assessment of where we're expecting flood hazards, so the likelihood of risk. And then you can see on the right actually what this meant in practice in terms of people's lives, people sitting, you know, huge areas flooded. And basically as part of that we include probabilistic assessments of the extent to which it's likely to exceed forecasts over the 20-year and 5-year expected levels. Clearly when you're doing this complicated modeling, it can be really, you know, the big question is, you know, are you really predicting what's going to happen? How reliable is this? And talking to statisticians, that would be the question that I would expect you to be asked. What we have done, and the Bristol and Copernicus have done some analysis to try and help us understand, well, how reliable, at least at sort of an aggregate level, these predictions were. So I just want you to compare the picture on the right with the picture on the far left. So the picture on the far left is the satellite image from the Sentinel of the observed flooding near sites near Beira, and on the right hand it's the model projections. And again, it still is a sort of a bit of an eyeball, does it look pretty similar? But for us operationally, I think it did. I mean, from looking at, you know, the assessments that we're receiving is that the predictions were strong, relatively strong, and also that, I mean, in terms of our operation, it really told us where are the highest risk areas and where are areas that we think are lower risk and if needs be, can be deprioritized. The second example I want to talk about is using data to predict how to respond to disease outbreaks. And this is work that came from a country office in Yemen, so it didn't come from my sort of central research investments. It came from a technical advisor and a country officer who reads Nature, reads The Lancet, and was thinking about what can I do to get ahead of our epidemic outbreaks. So that plot on the right is showing an epidemic outbreak. So, for example, of cholera. So usually what happens if you're somewhere like Yemen is you've got limited information, then you start to see cases of suspected cholera, and then the system kicks in and starts to respond. So effectively, by doing that, what we're doing is intervening when it's too late. We're intervening if there's a limited outbreak, the system's kicking in, and then we're detecting cases, but we've missed a lot of the epidemic outbreak. So what we were interested in is actually, can we predict and use predictive analysis to understand when the climatic and environmental conditions are ripe for a new outbreak to occur, and then start taking action here with the aim of then just bringing down the size of that outbreak curve. And this is work done with 2 universities in the US, the Met Office and NASA, and then UNICEF on the ground. And this advisor got inspired to try this from looking at a paper where some US academics had used reported surveillance data from Yemen to predict cholera outbreaks. And then we compared that with the reported cases that were collated by WHO. And what they found was that in 92% of districts forecasted to have a high risk, we did see a report in reported cholera cases. So what we did is work. Now, what was interesting about those academics is they could produce this model that had a very good predictive ability, but they didn't have the links into the agencies and the systems who could actually use that. So what our advisor did is then make those connections, start to create a relationship, and say, well, how do we use that modeling capability to really inform our response? And what we ended up developing with them was an algorithm to predict new cases of cholera that basically combines data on what we can know from satellite data about elevated temperature with predictions first from the Met Office about expectations on rainfall. And as part of working with the Met Office, we were in discussion about how do we continue to improve the accuracy of our predictions of rainfall in settings such as Yemen. And then on the ground, work with UNICEF to say, well, what do we know about areas where we've got high population density and where we know there are disruptions in access to so clean water services. And it's that combination that in the end we combine to say, okay, where do we think we're most likely to have a risk? And so on the left, you can see the aggregate of that analysis, which highlights areas across Yemen where we have the greatest risk of a new cholera outbreak. And then what UNICEF did is then where we have those areas of greatest risk, then we'll target their resource to that area and say, okay, let's increase communication, let's improve water and sanitation activities, so activities at the household level, activities focused on the water source, activities focused on water treatment plants, and then also to stand up health activities, so networks of community health workers who can identify people who might have cholera, and also strengthen and ensure we've got the right medicines and services in place for if there is a cholera outbreak. And in this case, I think what's powerful is it's a risk-based approach. It's saying we don't know if there's going to be one, but actually, given the high likelihood, this is where we're going to target our effort. We're in discussions at the moment with all of our partners to say, can we improve that predictive ability? Can we predict further into the future, which for us would help us because we could then potentially think about deploying vaccination campaigns? And also, can we get improved granularity so that we can actually focus in on smaller geographic areas when we're thinking about targeting response? And then the third example is one that I love, because if I thought about all the ways that I can use data and data science, I probably wouldn't have come up with tackling corruption straight away. It wouldn't have been top on the list. And this is a lovely example that's come out of an anti-corruption research program led by IDS, the Institute of Development Studies. And what that's done, and it's really taking the advantage of the opportunity of digitization of many payment systems. And what they've done is try and think about, well, are there red flags where, if you're thinking about a contracting process, it's an indicator that that's a higher risk of corruption. And we're interested in corruption as a department for obvious reasons, but particularly in corruption because of the size of the money that goes out, for example, through government and public tendering services or through tendering commissions with the World Bank. It's a corruption opportunity that is important. It could be substantial, but it's tricky to intervene. It's tricky to spot. But we're starting to develop these methods to do that. And these impacts of corruption on procurement have multiple impacts. It's not only that money might go into the wrong hands, it's also that you might have corrupt tendering processes. You might have things like shoddy construction material used, or you might have substitutions. So instead of making concrete, you make some standard product, which is cheaper, which in the end means that your road is washed away or some infrastructure is invested away. So the corruption can have a ripple effect in terms of the impact of our development investments. So if you take a step back, and as a scientist, mathematician, you go, well, if you think about the procurement process, and now that I'm DFID, I've learned a lot more about the procurement process than I never knew when I was a scientist. There's different ways you could try and fix it, right? You could try and fix what's the commission. You know, what's the thing that goes out and say, we want people to bid for this. Or you could influence the design so that there's only kind of one supplier who's in your pocket, who's your friend, you would be best placed to get that contract. Or you could limit the time between the launch and the closing date. So it means that people aren't, you really have to be in the know to be able to contract. Or you can fix who's involved in the evaluation. Is it one person? Is it multiple persons? These are all elements that actually, if you think about data around a contracting process, that you can start to look at. How many bids came in? Was there just one bid? Was there more than one bid? How short or long was the contracting process? All of these are very amenable to data analysis. So what the program did is collect data on contracting from, starting off with data from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and EuropeAid, and basically created a huge data set of 500,000 aid-funded projects covering 100 countries, and then identified key indicators of potential corruption, and these are the red flags. And then they developed software to then basically go through that data rapidly and flag, actually, this is the contract you might want to look at. This is where you might want to send in your investigation team. And what's been great about this is the data is open source, it's freely available, the software is freely available, and most recently, we've been supporting hackathons, so basically where students from the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences get to basically hack and look at that contracting data and the procurement data for their countries and say, what are programs that are potentially risky, where there's that red flag? To give you a sense of the scale, and this is from older data, from 98 to 2010, and since then I the World Bank has taken quite a few steps to tighten up its procurement processes. This is a sense of the percentage of public procurements where you have a single supplier. So that's one of those indicators of potential corruption. And you can see it's quite high. The average was 35% where you have a single supplier. Now, there might be legitimate reasons why you have a single supplier, but it starts to give you a sense of, well, actually, if you were going to be investigating or making sure you've got quality assurance procedures, this gives you a starting point to focus. And they've also done analyses of what it means around the price. So if you look at Peru, which is one of the darker colored countries, what the analysis suggests is that if a procurement process has two bidders instead of one, so there's a bit more competition, its average price falls a bit by 2.6%. That's not a big percentage. But if you think that Peru spends almost $80 billion through procurement in just 1 year, if you can increase the bidder numbers, that could give you billions of billions of dollars in saving. So even these small changes, by changing your system and red flagging, can, in development terms, give you potentially huge savings or huge increases in efficiency. And I've shown you in the previous slide, sub-Saharan African countries, but just to level things out a bit, this is just the findings on corruption risk from similar assessments in infrastructure spending by region across Europe, just to illustrate that it's not like we can look over and other countries and say they've got a problem and we haven't. In this case, it seems like there's some regions in otherwise low corruption risk countries that carry high risk, so you've got these sort of hotspots. Okay, so that's 3 examples that for me are very timely, very recent things that I've been thinking about and we've been applying kind of in recent months. I now want to move on to just talking a bit about some of their work in AI that's coming out, which is really in that sort of innovation technology for good space. And for me, I think the thing that amazes me and surprises me is the breadth of the application of AI that is emerging. And indeed, I had a conversation with my science advisory group a few weeks ago to help me think through this, is how do we try and get a grasp of the breadth of opportunities of AI? What are the ways as a development agency we should be trying to move this field forward? So what I'm going to share is a bit of scoping from that mapping that I did to inform my science advisory group. And so we're seeing things like humanitarian settings. So for example, in water resources, so that's using AI that's enabling us to understand much more about water quality across different humanitarian settings, and it's basically using data that's routinely collected by the humanitarian agencies. And what this is trying to do is to understand what are the issues on the ground in much more granularity, but also using that to inform emergency water treatment protocols are in place and actually responsive to the issues that are being seen. Another area that's coming out of our research investments is about how do we automate plant diagnosis. So if we think about feeding the world's population, plant diseases are a major threat, and it's an arms race, right? Diseases evolve. We introduce new crop species, new pesticides, new ways of farming. Diseases constantly evolve. And there what we're investing in and evaluating is improved diagnostic capabilities that's using image recognition, which is trying to detect different types of plant disease by looking at basically photos of infected leaves or fruit. And this is an app that's been kind of building on other work in this area. And our starting point, but we're expecting it to expand out, is to focus on cassava, but then potentially expand out to other plants and pests. And then the third example is one that is an unexpected outcome of a different type of research investment. So we've invested in a smart pump, which is basically got a solar transmitter that can tell us when a hand water pump isn't being used. So we'd invested in that as a way to set up to support smart businesses where you can sell this technology, put it on the pump. If the pump's not working, a company can say, I know that pump's not working, and send out somebody to fix it. So there's a business model, there's a nice local business model as part of that using smart technology. But what we're seeing is actually by understanding the frequencies of the pump and basically of the water being drawn up, we can use that to understand about groundwater depth. So it's giving us a way to map and to monitor over time using AI what might be the depth of groundwater across Africa. And that's incredibly important because that's the main source of water for many rural communities. We also are seeing things like how do we use drones and AI to monitor the impact of innovations. So for example, we have programs that are trying to protect and manage rainforests. Now we can use drones to take photos of what's happening in terms of coverage, but increasingly AI is being used to say, actually, let's get more precise about what's happening Let's understand what's the density, what's the distribution of species that are there, what are we seeing declines in density of forests. And these sorts of technologies are really useful if you think about a rainforest in a remote area where going out and doing any sort of on-the-ground mapping would be very difficult. Similarly, in EdTech, we are testing, we've got a big digital program that's in the pipeline that will test educational methods using AI, where the aim is to gear educational learning directly to the student. So a student will have an app where if they're struggling with maths, the materials they're exposed to is directly targeted to their ability. And that's incredibly useful, again, in developing countries, where you might have one teacher with a lot of students. And so being able to use technology to tailor the support to the direct needs of students is potentially a huge opportunity. And lastly, work around AI to understand, how do we understand traffic flows, what are the drivers of blockages in traffic, and then what might be the interventions that could tackle that and test that using the AI technology. So we're seeing AI have a lot of potential. As well as those innovations, we're thinking about what are the policy side of this area. So, at one level, there's all this excitement, but with any advance in technology, there's the risk that poor countries get left behind. And if anything, advances in technology increase inequality versus reduce inequality. So we're thinking in the policy space about how do we support countries, developing countries, to think about what's the policy space, what are the regulations they might need to have in place to think about use of big data, what's their perspective on how the sort of uses that are useful or what might be the risks. And really trying to think about also how do we support capability of countries and statistical offices to not only be able to do the census, the sort of analyses, the types of analyses that they might historically have been commissioned to do, but to really evolve and be skilled up in issues such as AI and other forms of data innovation. When we're thinking about AI in developing countries, one of the issues that was flagged to me and that I hadn't really thought about until that was the issue of language, and how much as we increasingly think about digital and data services, AI, how much it's really, all the tools are being tailored basically to the languages of richer countries. And actually, if we are going to be thinking about how do we increase the opportunity and how do we reduce the risk of inequality, we really need to pay attention to issues around language as well as competency on the technical side. So I've given you a bit of some of our thinking on data innovation. I wouldn't be allowed to stand here in front of you and go back to my data colleagues in DFID without also flagging some of the core investments and partnerships that we support. And so we have been a long-term supporter of things like GODAN, the Paris 21 agreement, UN stats. We're very much committed to and want to support the UN system to respond and support the data revolution and to think about how do we do that well and what's the sort of governance and regulation systems that we need in place. How do we make sure Southern voices are at the table? We also have a historic relationship with country offices, and there our focus has been really about how do we get the basics right? How do we support developing countries to do the things they need to do, but also to evolve? We also increasingly are focusing on thinking about at a global level, how do we support the data architecture around the SDGs? There are hundreds of indicators. Countries are being asked to report on those. How do we support the structures that will make that easy, will ensure interoperability, will try and reduce the burden and really tap into opportunities of sharing learning across countries? Our investment is focusing. So historically, when we're investing in data, it was very much budget support to national statistical offices. We then moved to focusing on results around data that will really drive development impacts in areas that are core priority. So particularly, for example, linked to the MDGs. We're now focusing much more on how do we make sure we're really targeting our investment in supporting the opportunities of the data revolution. That includes in that data revolution investments increasing investment in geospatial analysis, and in particular thinking about how do we support countries across Africa to be able to access geospatial data. So things like supporting the Africa Regional Data Cube, which has the ambition of laying satellite imagery, Earth observations, along with other types of data, and have that in a way that's accessible, that's geocoded, and that's something that can be used by countries. At the moment, the focus is very much on a few select areas, so urban planning, illegal mining, and flood control. But that issue of how do we create that opportunity of big data for developing countries is high on our priority list. It includes also things like investing in geospatial data around core elements. How do we think about the evolution of the census? How can we potentially support countries with limited data systems on the ground to be able to access high-resolution population data that will complement the national census systems that might fill in the gaps between censuses? And that's work that we're doing in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And lastly, we're thinking about what does it mean for the kinds of support that we need to invest in to support systems of data governance and capability. And so it's, as well as the opportunities, we're thinking about what do we do to support and ensure that the statistical community around the world have the right skills and culture. It includes looking at ourselves quite hard in DFID, and thinking about, what's the capabilities we need within our own technical staff? We recognize we need much more data capability, people who can enable us to tap into the opportunities, but also supporting others. It's investing in leaders in the field. We're also supporting the UN Stats Commission and strengthening our capability by opening up a new ONS DFID hub within our office in Scotland. So that's going to enable us to form new partnerships with the science community, but also the hope is that we can tap into some of the science innovations that I've talked about earlier, but think about how can we potentially apply those across a number of country offices. So I talked about predicting cholera outbreaks in Yemen. It would be nice here to predict cholera outbreaks across a range of African countries where we have weak data systems and where that early action could be really, really important. And also investing in and supporting national data systems and structures that can also be part of taking advantage of the opportunity. Clearly, there's huge issues of data governance. There's issues of ownership, accessibility, security, and quality. I think it's the agenda that we're all trying to think about, and it's very much areas that we're very keen to work in partnership to move forward. So I hope I've given you a flavor of the ways that we're thinking about data and some of the initiatives that we have in harnessing data for opportunities for development. What we're seeing is the world is facing immense and evolving challenges. There are huge opportunities in the data space to do more, to take action more effectively and more efficiently and more rapidly, and we're very keen to continue our investment to try and facilitate that. We've got a lot of innovations from within our portfolio. That's a small subset of the broader innovations that are happening across the academic community. And we're very keen to be continuing to try and learn, to try and synthesize, and particularly try and use our influence to think about how can we connect the innovations with the people who can use that, and how can we translate and share and scale up effective interventions that could really potentially make a huge impact of scale. We are still going to care about national statistical offices and national statistical capability, but for us, our focus will evolve to be also how do we support them to harness the opportunities of big data and the data revolution. And we're also interested in thinking about how do we use our influence as a major player and work in partnership with governments around the world to think about what are the governance issues. We're very much committed to open data, but what does that look like in practice, and how do we think about managing the risk? And in all of this, partnership is critical. Partnership with people in this room, partnership with countries in the global south, and partnership with increasingly the private sector, the UN system in moving this forward. Thank you.